Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter and podcast in Florida where we explore the ways big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in this state. The name seeking rents comes from a term in economics called rent seeking. And rent seeking refers to when a someone with lots of wealth and influence uses their wealth and influence to get laws changed in their favor in a way that allows them to capture even more wealth and influence for themselves, usually at the expense of someone else, like workers or consumers or potential small business competitors. So here's a stat that I find absolutely staggering. Nearly half of all families in Florida are now unable to afford the basic cost of living in their county. That's more than 4 million households across the state, out of about 8.8 million households in the state as a whole. And it makes Florida one of the very worst states in the country for financial hardship, 44th out of 51 states, including the District of Columbia. Now, this is all according to a new report from the United Way of Florida. The Miami Herald and Tampa Bay Times just had a fantastic piece going deep onto this report and its ramifications. But this report doesn't really get into why this is the case, why Florida does so poorly when it comes to financial hardship for particularly folks in the working and middle class. But I would argue that a big reason is the way Florida taxes its residents. Florida's tax system is upside down. That means Florida government takes more money from its poorest residents than it does from its wealthiest ones. And to show you what I mean by that, let's talk about the different tax rates paid by Florida families in three different income brackets. And these figures actually come from a different report. This one was produced by an organization known as the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, or ITEP for short. ITEP is a left-leaning tax research and policy advocacy group in Washington, D.C. that studies state tax codes around the country. I'm going to read these figures so I make sure to get them right. And let's start with families earning more than about $740,000 a year. That's the top 1% of households in Florida. And the top 1% of households in Florida pay an average of 2.7% of their income in state and local taxes when you add up all the different taxes that Florida charges. So that's sales tax, property tax, gas tax, cell phone taxes, and so on. This is what's known as the effective state tax rate. And 2.7% is the second lowest effective state tax rate on the top 1% in the entire country. Only South Dakota gives rich families a better deal than Florida does. But then think about families earning between about $36,000 a year up to about $62,000 a year. That's the middle 20% of households in Florida. And they pay an effective state tax rate of 9.5%. And that's much closer to the middle of the pack nationally. Florida ranks 13th out of 51 in terms of the lowest tax rate on middle income households. And then you get to the lowest income folks in Florida. These are folks making less than $20,000 a year, which puts them in the bottom 20% of households in Florida. And those families pay an effective state tax rate of 13.2%. That's the seventh highest effective state tax rate on low-income families in the entire country. So here's another way to think about this. The state of Florida taxes low-income families nearly 5 times as much as it does the top 1% of families. And it taxes middle-income families more than 3 times as much as it taxes the top 1%. So you've got a state where nearly half of all families are struggling to make ends meet, and a state tax code that is actively making their lives even harder. But here is the good news. We can actually do something about this. There are a number of easy steps that Florida could take that would both help families struggling to make ends meet and make its tax code fairer for the working and middle class. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And we're going to do it with Esteban Santis, a policy analyst at the Florida Policy Institute, which is a progressive think tank right here in Florida that promotes policies that are meant to improve the economic mobility and quality of life for all Floridians, not just the folks at the very top. Esteban is a PhD and one of the smartest people I know when it comes to tax policy. And he's got a bunch of ideas, but we're going to focus on one policy proposal in particular. It's called the Working Floridians Tax Rebate, and it's a proposed tax cut which means it's an idea that should presumably appeal to Republican politicians. And that's sort of important considering Florida Republicans have a trifecta in Florida, meaning they control the governor's mansion and both chambers of the state legislature. And honestly, I really do think this has the potential to become a bipartisan idea in Tallahassee, and it could help a lot of families, a lot more than you think. Anyway, I hope you'll find the conversation interesting. Dr. Esteban Santis, welcome to the show. Thank you for doing this.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
You've got to respect the PhD in this family too.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you very
You,
much.
you bet. So I talked about this sort of in the top of the show about just sort of how regressive Florida's tax code is. But one thing I didn't get into, and I'm wondering if you could, is what makes Florida's tax code so regressive?
Yes, and I'll give you the short answer and I'll give you the long answer here. The short answer is that the vast majority of state and local tax systems throughout the country are regressive or upside down. That means that these tax codes require a much greater share of income from low and middle income families than from wealthy families. And in some states, like Florida, Washington, Texas, for example, the absence of a graduated personal income tax, like the one we have at the federal level, leads to a heavy reliance on consumption taxes, like sales excise taxes, and this contributes to the effect. Now, the long answer, and here, we can get a little more historical with it and look at policies in Florida. A
Mhm.
century ago, in 1924, the state of Florida outlawed personal income taxes. It was through the legislature, and then they proposed a constitutional amendment and left it to voters. And I do want to add the caveat that it was in 1924, we have a very limited voting bloc. Not all Floridians had access to voting.
Right, right. And
And
I think I might know this from your research, but that was essentially a big push by the real estate industry.
yes, and when you look at the legislators, the industry, and you look at newspaper ads from the period, you see this promise that's being advertised, the promise that by not taxing wealth, by outlawing personal income taxes, we're going to attract more wealth, and in doing so, we're going to lift all Floridians up. Well, it's been 100 years, and if you look around, the promise has not materialized. And
Right.
yet, despite the experience of Floridians, tax policies in our state continue to appeal to the same promise that a rising tide will lift all boats, and we're simply not seeing it.
Right, right. Beyond sort of the lack of an income tax and lack of inheritance taxes, is there anything else in particular that stands out to you about what makes Florida's tax code so regressive?
And I'm glad you mentioned inheritance taxes and the lack of personal income taxes that we were talking about it. I think for me, three examples from our history always kind of pop up, and there's more, but some significant ones. In 1984, policymakers made it easier for multi-state and multinational corporations to avoid paying corporate income taxes by repealing combined reporting. This is a policy to close loopholes that corporations use to shift profits into subsidiaries and tax havens, and
Right.
this helps them lower their tax bill. There was a brief moment of time where we had this in Florida, but policymakers repealed it. Another moment in 2006, policymakers repealed the annual tax on stocks, bonds, and notes. And in doing so, as you mentioned, in terms of like wealth, right? It made it harder to tax wealth in our state. And then this one, which I know Seeking Rents has covered, Jason, you've covered. In 2021, policymakers passed an online sales tax bill set to raise $1 billion annually, but used the revenue to cut Florida's reemployment tax, which by and large helped corporations. And, you know, when we this is not happening in a vacuum. So I know you mentioned United Way. Today, as the report by United Way explains, almost half of households in our state struggle to make ends meet.
Right.
Ends meet. That's 4 million households across Florida that are either struggling to or cannot afford basic necessities like housing, childcare, food, transportation, and healthcare. And to be specific, the United Way finds that 13% of Florida households are currently living below the federal poverty level, which for a family of three, it's just under $26,000 annually.
That's wild. More than 10%, more than one in 10 families.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
then to add to that, 33% of households are also called are so-called Alice households, as United
Right.
Way names them. And that means they're asset limited, income constrained, and employed. They're households who earn money, who earn income. They earn more than the federal poverty level, but not enough to afford the basic necessities of
Right.
living in the community, you know?
One in
So
three households in Florida.
which is which is remarkable.
A
And
staggering number.
what does this have to do with taxes? It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
Our tax code, which favors wealthy residents and businesses, also overburdens the same very households that are struggling to afford those basic necessities. And this is because of some of the decisions we mentioned. It is because of our dependence on sales taxes and also property taxes, which are regressive. And sales taxes and property taxes are our primary means of balancing our state budget and balancing our local budgets. So it comes really as no surprise that as ITEP, the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, recently ranked Florida as the most upside down or regressive tax code in the country. When we look at our historical decisions, when we look at how we balance our budget, it's no surprise.
Right. And just before I sort of jump to the solution or a potential solution that we're going to talk about, but what do we know about how this tax structure and this sort of the financial hardship factor in Florida? What do we know about how that sort of impacts various how that impact varies across different populations? I'm thinking here of like, Black families or Latine families or different demographic groups. Do we see disparities in how this ultimately lands on folks?
Yes. So United Way, for example, estimates that 60% of Black and 52% of Latine households do not make enough to afford the basics. In
Wow.
comparison, 41% of white households are struggling. This is not to say one's struggling most, but we do see disparities when we look at those racial and ethnic groups. And I also do want to note that in 2022, 42% of families with children were also below the United Way's Alice threshold, which is, that survival basic necessities budget.
Wow.
So a lot of families, as we've mentioned, are struggling. Now, the bottom line when it comes to race and ethnic disparities in our state, historic and current injustices in public policy and just in broader society have resulted in disparities in income and wealth across race, ethnicity, unequal opportunities to access education, housing, jobs, capital, and other economic resources have resulted in stark income and wealth gaps between white families and most communities of color. And I can give you just an example of how policy decisions impact some of this.
Yeah, please
So
do.
between 1931 and 2006, the state government levied a tax on intangible property. That's the stocks, bonds, and banknotes that we mentioned. And also, this included a one-time tax payment on mortgages. However, policymakers repealed the tax on stocks, bonds, and notes in 2006. And the outcome of this change disproportionately benefited white, wealthy households. According to the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve, about 60% of white households owned stocks in 2007, so a year after the repeal. In contrast, only 34% of Black households and 27% of Latina households owned stocks during that same time period. By cutting the tax on intangibles on stocks, bonds, and notes, we policymakers effectively gave a tax break to white wealthy households who owned those kinds of investments and then continued to rely on sales taxes, which partially impacts, individuals who are making low to moderate income. That's just one example of how we use the tax code to benefit one group over the other.
Right.
And, in the Sunshine State, the truth is that the lower one's income, the higher one's overall effective tax rate.
Right. That makes total sense when you read those reports. And it's always struck me as like one of the most illuminating details of kind of the priorities of Tallahassee the last 25 years is that the very last bill Governor Jeb Bush signed before he left office, the thing he made sure to get done was to eliminate the intangibles tax. And I'm going off memory here, but by the time he repealed it, I believe it was only paid by families with I believe it was $400,000 of non-retirement investments. Maybe it was 250,000. It was
it's you're right. You're right, and also it's more because it's 250,000 per taxpayer. So how it would have been $500,000 would have been exempt on
wow.
those investments. So we're not talking about everyday families having to pay this tax. It was families who had over, if you were single, 250,000, or if you were married, filing a married couple filing jointly, $500,000 in these investments.
And Jeb used to claim he was doing it for seniors and savers. That's who he claimed he was helping. Well, okay, so let me shift gears here a bit. You touched on a couple of things in that like are really sort of like, singing to me in terms of combined reporting and how important I think that is. We've written a lot about it on the newsletter, and I think I've talked about it on podcasts and stuff. And for folks who don't know what that refers to, it's essentially an easy way to close a bunch of corporate tax loopholes that other states have closed, but Florida continues to leave open. But the reality is we're living in a state with a Republican trifecta in Tallahassee, and so proposals that raise tax revenue tend to sort of start from a place of immediate suspicion amongst Republicans. Unless it's Senate Bill 50 in 2021, in which case you're going to raise a bunch of taxes from working consumers and then give all that money to businesses. But
Yeah.
that's another show. But there's a different policy that you guys have been advocating for, and I think I'm going to get this right, the Working Floridians Tax Rebate, that is a tax cut. And so I wanted to talk a bit more about how that would work. And let me, to sort of set the table on that, my understanding is that would play off of the federal earned income tax credit. Assuming if I'm right there, maybe start by, can you tell us a bit about how the earned income tax credit, what that is and how it works?
Yes, of course. And yes, you're right, Jason. The Working Floridians Tax Rebate Program would be pegged to the federal Earned Income Tax Credit. The Earned Income Tax Credit, EITC or EIC, so you'll hear those interchangeably. It was first enacted on a temporary basis in 1975. It was a modest tax credit. It provided financial assistance to working families making low income with children. But after various legislative changes over the past 40 years, the credit is now one of the federal government's largest anti-poverty programs. The federal EITC is a common sense tax credit that helps those families with low to moderate income. It helps them make ends meet. It benefits their families, communities, and local economies. Now, by design, the federal EITC benefits people who work. Workers receive a credit equal to a percentage of their earnings up to a maximum amount. Both the credit rate and maximum credit are going to vary by family size, with larger credits available to families with more children. In 2023, for example, the maximum credit for a family with one child was just under $4,000, while the maximum credit for families with three or more children was $7,430. There's also a credit for what the IRS would call a childless worker, so an individual without a child. At the time, the maximum was 600. So in comparison to the credit for a family with children, it's not as much, but there's still something for an individual without children. And after the credit reaches its maximum, it's going to remain flat until it reaches a phase-out period, and then it declines until there's no credits. So this ensures that only individuals up to a certain level of income are going to receive this. And it really is one of the nation's most effective tools for reducing poverty, countering income inequality, and also throughout its history, its 40-year history, it's received bipartisan support.
Yeah, that makes sense. Although maybe nobody tell JD Vance that we apparently have a tax credit for childless cat ladies. You alluded to this. I had no idea actually that the EITC went back that long, and you started to mention this. But could you tell me a bit more about what impact it's had since it's been around so long? Like how effective an anti-poverty program is it, or is that even the right
Yeah,
way to think about it?
well, it's much broader than that. Oftentimes we'll hear that like, as I mentioned, it's really one of our big tools, anti-poverty tools, but it's more than that. It's, the fact that we've had 40 years does give us some rich data to study. So studies on the earned income tax credit over decades indicate that it has a substantial impact on workers making low income by increasing labor force participation, particularly among single mothers. It offers long-term earnings growth, and it helps lift families out of poverty. That's one component of it. We see some recent studies that have found that the EITC can also reduce food insecurity, and it also can help increase private insurance participation. That's more on the economic aspect of it. We also see that by even just marginally expanding the earned income tax credit and eligibility, you see improvements in health outcomes,
Oh,
particularly for
wow.
women and children. And then there's another component here. We have decades of research that show that children and families that receive the earned income tax credit see improvements in academic achievement and attainment. We see that children in households that receive the ITC see improved math and reading scores.
Mhm.
We see an increased likelihood of finishing high school, obtaining a college degree, and many of the EITC's educational benefits are actually more significant for boys and Black and Latina children. So the AITC works to lift families out of poverty, not only by having those economic kind of effects, but also by helping through this kind of educational, I would say maybe positive externalities. So you're helping not only the current generation, you're providing also a path for upward mobility and helping future ones. So there's a lot of research out there that speaks to the benefits of the policy. And by and large, I mean, you're gonna find that it's been positive, you know.
That's great. And you sort of start to see why it's so bipartisan at the federal level. Okay, so let's shift. How would the working Floridians tax rebate build on that? Because, and just to level set here, one of sort of my like broad understandings of Florida taxes, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but like one of the challenges to trying to make the state's tax code a little bit fairer, a little bit more progressive is the fact that there is no income tax, which is usually the easiest way to start kind of like targeting tax relief
Exactly.
by income levels. So maybe tell me how the working Floridians tax rebate would work, and how does it kind of get around some of that sort of targeting challenge?
Yes, and it's a valid concern, and it's a considerable challenge, particularly because this is going to be pegged at the federal level. So we have to find a way to get access to that data, or at least to, yeah, data. So the way that the Working Floridians Tax Rebate Program would work, we would create the program within Florida's Department of Revenue, and with the intention of offering a rebate for residents earning low to moderate income. And the rebate, if you were to read the bill as it's been proposed in previous sessions, it is a rebate to offer relief on sales taxes, fuel taxes, and property taxes,
Okay.
which are all regressive. So the goals of the program are consistent with the federal earned income tax credit. So I want to highlight that. And in terms of implementation, each person or household who qualified for and received a federal earned income tax credit in a specific year would receive a rebate if and then there's going to be essentially some stipulations, they maintain a Florida residence on the person's or household's federal income tax during the tax year in which they're applying for the WFTR, the Working Floridians Tax Rebate Program. They will have to apply to the Department of Revenue directly using a form developed by the Department of Revenue, and they will have to provide documentation to the Department of Revenue to verify the receipt and specific amount of the federal earned income tax credit. And within 30 days of receiving a completed application and verifying the information, the Department of Revenue would then issue a check to the individual, or you could even use direct deposit to the individual in the amount of 20% of their federal EITC. So essentially, it's a 20% boost on the federal EITC that the person or household received. And then we have others, if you were to read the bill, there are other stipulations for the program. One of them, the Department of Revenue would be required to prepare a report to the governor, the legislature, essentially addressing the feasibility of creating and implementing an automatic WFTR program using data provided by the Internal Revenue Service or another federal agency so that a person or household may receive the funds without having to apply. Now, if the Department of Revenue determines that this is not feasible, then they'll have to specify what are the barriers to creating the automatic program and then provide some solutions. So until then, it would require individuals to apply directly to the Department of Revenue.
Okay, you sort of you anticipated one of the questions I had. So let me say that back just so I understand. So essentially what it sounds like is basically anyone who qualifies for the federal earned income tax credit would then be eligible for essentially a check equal to an extra 20% from the state as a rebate for all the state taxes they pay, the
Exactly.
sales tax, cell phone taxes, whatever the taxes may be, gas taxes like you mentioned. So that's how that would work.
Yes.
And initially it would be you would have to go pursue this, which I assume creates all sorts of challenges in terms of getting folks, to actually pursue the
Review it.
benefits thorough, right? But
Yeah.
the goal would be to identify a way to make this automatic. Whereas if you file on your federal taxes, if you qualify for the earned income tax credit, you're going to get a check or a deposit from the state of Florida automatically for another 20%. Is that right?
Yes, effectively cutting those other taxes. And
Right.
you also alluded to, or not even alluded, you mentioned another component that I think a program like the Working Floridians Tax Rebate would also boost. Right now, 80% of only 80% of individual, well, let me say that back. Right now, not everyone who applies or who would qualify for the earned income tax credit actually applies for the earned income tax credit at the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
So we do not have full participation in the earned income tax credit. Only 80% of eligible individuals are applying it. So there's a 20% of Floridians who would be eligible to receive the earned income tax credit who are also not getting it. By having something like the Working Floridians Tax Rebate Program and increasing the visibility of the earned income tax credit, it's possible we also boost participation of the earned income tax credit at the federal level so that they can actually get it at the state level. So I also see that as another benefit that we typically don't talk about, but the
Right.
truth is that there are individuals right now who are not only who are missing out on their earned income tax rate because they're not applying for it. So hopefully this program boosts that visibility and gets more people to apply. But as you mentioned, when we start out, if the policymakers adopt this program, the participation rate is going to be a hurdle. So getting the information out and making sure people know about it is going to be key.
That makes sense. Not to go off on too much of a tangent, but one of the smaller vetoes that always just like struck me as particularly kind of cruel in Ron DeSantis is when he vetoed $1 billion from the state budget this year. There was, and I forget where it was, but there was money for a program to help low income folks in, I think, Miami, but I'm not certain of that. With their tax preparation, and it was entirely designed around driving uptake of the earned income tax
Yeah,
credit. And that's like you're not just like you're not just helping folks get a tax break that they're entitled to. You're also then bringing this money into Florida, right? So it's like
exactly.
it's good for the economy. It's not just good for these households. And I'm actually going to ask something related to that in just like, but before I do you have any sort of sense, or does anybody have any sense on like how many people would this ultimately affect in Florida? Like how many people are we talking about? How much money are we talking about? What's the
Yeah,
sort of scale of this potentially?
we have estimates. So, I'll mention it in terms of households because we're looking at individuals or
Hmm.
households who are filing taxes. So in 2022, approximately 1.9 million Florida households received over $4.9 billion thanks to their earned income tax credit, with an average credit of nearly 2,536. Now, by enacting the Working Floridians Tax Rebate Program, we would be providing essentially over 2 million Florida households, because this tends to grow over time. So we'll be providing over 2 million Florida households, including an estimated 1.6 million households with children present,
Wow.
an opportunity to receive an additional $1.1 billion on top of the federal EITC, with an estimated average rebate of just over $500. So, direct to answer your question again, to recap, we're seeing that over 2 million individuals are going to be receiving some boost. Right now, the federal government is essentially, through their earned income tax credit, giving Florida families, households $4.9 billion. This would add 1.1 billion on top of that.
Wow. And I just want to sort of like put a finer point on that. So I started this episode off, but before I started talking to you about that United Way report, and I think you mentioned it as well. but that found that more than 4 million households in Florida are struggling to make ends meet. And if I'm understanding you right, this program would be at least half of those households would get $500 each on average. Like
Yes.
that's incredible. And then
Yes.
and that doesn't even get into the point you're making of there's some number of households that presumably would eventually be reached that aren't applying for the earned income tax credit originally themselves. So they're, in addition to the average $500 from the state, they'll get whatever the federal tax savings are. And suddenly that you start to make a real difference in people's circumstances there, I would imagine.
Yes, and it's the type of tax reform that we need in Florida. It would help those families that are mentioned in the United Way report. And yeah, 2 million households plus really starts to get us in a direction where we're using the tax code for everyday Floridians, as opposed to how we have been using it over the past 100 years.
Yeah, and let me ask you just as a follow-up point on that. So obviously this is a direct sort of cash infusion to folks at the lower end of the economic ladder, but what do we know about what happens when you do that? Like are there ripple impacts? Is it right to think of this as solely a benefit for these households, or is there a larger benefit from directing kind of economic resources this way?
That's such a good question. And you're right. I mean, studies show that EITC recipients spend their rebates on durable goods, purchasing or repairing a vehicle for work,
Mhm.
or paying off bills and debt. EITC recipients spend a significant portion of their rebates locally. And when we look at case studies, they have shown that for every dollar increase in earned income tax credit benefits, we see a $1 to $2 return worth of economic activity.
Oh,
In
wow.
yeah, in Florida, if the WFTR program generates $1 worth of economic activity for additional ATC benefits, and recipients spend, which we see around 80% of it locally, which they probably will, then the policy would generate $881 million for our state economy. We're not only helping those households, we're also just injecting money directly into our local economies. It's it's a fantastic program.
Yeah, it makes total sense. And I guess just logically, when you think about it, if you're struggling to make ends meet right now, you don't have enough money to be saving, right? So the money you
Exactly.
get is immediately going to get put into necessity. So it immediately circulates around the
Yeah.
economy. It's kind of, we earlier in the show we were talking about how, Jeb Bush made it a priority to cut taxes for folks that have, 250,000 or more in non-retirement investments, right? Stock
Yeah.
investments.
Yeah.
And those are folks that a lot of times they get extra money that just goes right back into savings, right? Where in this
Exactly.
case, this money ends up going into, auto mechanics, going to grocery stores, going to restaurants, going to, you know, pharmacies, all sorts of like the everyday needs, going to landlords for that matter. It really does circulate right through the economy.
It does.
You know, this bill, I think you mentioned, and I don't actually full on know this history, but you mentioned that this has been filed in the past, this proposal. Do you have any sense, like how many times have folks tried to get this on the radar in Tallahassee, and
Yes.
what has been the reception in Tallahassee? Obviously, it hasn't passed yet. Has there been pushback? Has there just kind of been silence, or tell me what you've heard so far, and what, if anything, we've learned about how to try and advocate for this policy?
Yeah, the Working Floridians Tax Rebate, I will say, is the latest iteration of a history that goes back to 2001.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, in 2001 is the first time we see a proposal to create a state earned income tax credit. At the time, this credit would have been pegged at 20% of the federal EITC, but it died in committee. So that was in 2001. It's not until 2019 that we see a new effort to create a similar program. And 2019, it dies in committee. In 2020, we see yet again another effort. Again, both bills, there was one in the House and Senate. The 2020 bill is going to die in committee. It wasn't until 2022 that we see the actual introduction of what we're talking about now, which is
Okay.
the Work Employees Tax Rebate Program. The bill ultimately died in committee. And then this past legislative session, we saw proposals to create the Work Employees Tax Rebate, and it died in committee. But I will say it also came up during conversations on the Florida tax package as an
Oh,
amendment.
interesting. Oh,
And
that's good.
the amendment would have created a study to see what the impact of this policy would have been, but ultimately it was voted down. So I do think, I don't necessarily know that legislators are against the idea, but I think they're not aware of, I don't think they're aware of the, I'm going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say they're not aware of the benefits and they're probably still thinking about some of the challenges in implementation, which we talked about. We can implement this, and there are ways that we can raise the revenue to create, to make sure that this is a long-term program. So I'm going to give everyone the benefit of the doubt and say they just need more information, and that's what we're doing. We're giving it to them.
That's right. Here's hoping they listen to this
Yes.
podcast. I know I mentioned this offline, but I know a few of them do. I don't think they would super appreciate me identifying them, but I know some of them do. How many other states have done something like this, kind of a state level earned income tax credit? And
Yes.
and
Yes.
and more specifically, have any non-state income tax states, ooh, that's a mouthful. Have any of
Yeah.
them also done this?
And to answer the question, yes to the second question. But to build on the success of the federal earned income tax credit, 31 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico have enacted their own version of the EITC, pegged at a percentage of, most by and large, pegged at a percentage of the federal credit. All but 3 states with an EITC peg it at the federal level. So the other ones essentially use, they set it up at a percentage of income, but most states will just look at the federal EITC and they'll use a percentage of that. In tax year 2023, we saw state credits as a percentage of the ATC range from a refundable 3% in Montana to a non-refundable 125% in South Carolina, which sounds good, but because it's non-refundable, it
Non-refundable,
really
right?
doesn't impact.
And
So
and and Esteban,
yeah,
explain what refundable means to folks,
yes.
because and the reason I'm having you do it, I'm not like fully sure I understand it. So
Yeah, we'll break it down. So a refundable credit, essentially, everyone, when they look at their tax bill, they are either going to owe or they're not going to owe. If you
Mhm.
owe money, a refundable tax credit is going to help lower that. And if you meet your liability and you have any excess, anything over that, if it's refundable, you're getting that money back. If it's non-refundable, it's going to help lower your liability. It could even cancel it out. But if there's any excess amount, you don't get that. And that's really it. So you want a refundable credit to create the most impact. To date, among the states that have those refundable EITCs, we see set at a percentage of the federal level. We see that the highest rates are in the District of Columbia, it's 70%, Maryland, 45%, and New Jersey at 40%. So, Florida going for 20%, we wouldn't even be up there in
Right.
terms of how high the rebates are. I will say also, when you look at earned income tax credit eligibility, not everyone does get this. For example, there are age limits to receive the earned income tax credit at the federal level. You have to be at least 25 years of age and you have to be under 65. So you do have some states that have essentially tried to expand eligibility. States like Colorado, California, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, New Jersey, New Mexico, they've actually also adjusted theirs to include more individuals, to include younger workers that are
Mhm.
under 25. So I will, and then some other changes. So just because you're pegging it to the federal level doesn't mean you don't have room to adjust and experiment. When you look at federal eligibility rules, you also are required to have a social security number. Well, not everyone who pays taxes has a social security number. Some individuals can file taxes using an individual taxpayer identification number or ITIN. So you could actually be paying taxes, but because you don't have a social security number, you're not going to receive this credit at the federal level. And if you're using a state credit pegged at the federal level, you're also not going to get that. Because of this, you're also seeing states like California and Colorado, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, New Mexico, Oregon, and Washington. They've also made their credit available to ITIN filers. And the reason I kind of highlight Washington, and this gets to
Mm.
your second question. Sorry about the roundabout answer here,
No,
but
this is great.
in 2021, Washington State became the first state without an individual income tax to enact a state
Right.
EITC. And the credit essentially took effect in 2023. You have to be a Washington resident. You file an application to the state. And then Washington essentially is a little bit different from the other states in that they base it off a person's income and they have a whole scale of how they do it. So it's not pegged at the federal level, but it is a state EITC. Just the implementation is a little bit different. Ours would mirror or follow Washington's lead in that we also don't have a personal income tax, but we can do it. Washington did it. That's essentially proof of concept.
Right.
We can do it the way that we explained it. And I will say, even states like Texas right now, I know there are efforts there to create a state EITC, and that would be another big state that doesn't have a personal income tax pursuing this similar policy. So we'll stay tuned to see what happens in Texas, how that campaign goes. But I will say, by and large, a vast majority of the country does this. Not having a personal income tax is not a challenge. We see that it is possible. And really, we should just be leaders in the South and do it.
Right. Yeah, we Florida leaders love to compete with Texas. Maybe we can compete with Texas to be the first like big South state to do this.
It's a huge tax cut. I mean, we can do it.
Yeah, I am happy to give Ron DeSantis and the Florida legislature all the flowers they deserve if they genuinely do a tax cut that actually helps working folks rather than businesses for once, rather than and not just a sales tax holiday that doesn't actually save anybody any real money.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. Before I didn't mean to sort of set off that trigger tax holiday hatred, which I know we both share. But before we wrap this up, let me just sort of not that any of this stuff is easy to do in soundbite levels, but like obviously we went deep on this, but what are some other, if world according to Esteban, what are some of the other policy leaders that you would want to see, you would encourage Florida leaders to think about when it comes to, either directly helping, the folks that are really financially struggling, these 4 million households we talked about, or that speak towards reforming our tax system so it's a little bit fairer, so it's not quite so upside down as it is right now.
Exactly. So I will say, as we mentioned throughout, our conversation, it's not only sales taxes. We also rely on property taxes, which are also regressive. Now, I do not think the solution is to eliminate property taxes. Property taxes support local services, mainly, also particularly public education. There is a good rationale for having property taxes. Now, what we can do is we can adjust our property tax code to ensure that it's not as regressive. So I think there are several opportunities there. And one that it sounds crazier than it is, but we do have the tools in Florida to create a mansion tax. We could adopt a tax on just really high value homes. Across the country, 33 states, DC, they have what we call real estate transfer taxes. We are one of those states that has it. We call it a documentary stamp tax, but that's a real estate transfer tax. We could expand it to include an additional tax on real estate sales above, say, $1 million. So as such, only the portion of the sale that's above $1 million would be subject to a very modest tax. Recently, the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, and also the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy, they estimated that a 4% tax on just that portion above $1 million would generate almost $1.5 billion annually in state revenue. That's money that then policymakers could use to create a rebate program or fund other services. And that would help us offset some of that regressive upside down feature of property taxes. That's one idea. And we do have the tools. We have the tax structure there. It's simply a matter of expanding our documentary stamp tax. Another idea, and I'm using what we have in Florida, the tools that we have in Florida, the structures that we have and set, and also maybe some historical examples here. We could also reenact Florida's sales tax on services, but focus on luxury services. A little bit of history here. After serving as mayor of Tampa, Bob Martinez became Florida's 40th governor. And as governor, Governor Martinez supported one of the largest tax increases in our state's history. It was a very short-lived services tax. The legislature passed that tax in 1987. But to be clear, there was corporate backlash, there was private
Right.
backlash, and it was,
Newspapers.
newspapers
Newspapers are
were
one of the
involved.
worst lobbies in that.
And that tax was repealed the very same year during a special session.
Right.
Now, unlike the general sales tax, you could expand taxation on services and adjust it to make our tax code less regressive. The way that you do this is that you apply the tax to services that are predominantly purchased or used by affluent households. So I'm thinking here maybe country club memberships, services of investment counselors, or swimming pool cleaning services. So there we have options here that we could tap into. And it's just a matter of creativity and looking into that. But I know that policymakers in our state have talked about consumption taxes. And I'm not a fan of consumption taxes because it exacerbates, it worsens our
Right.
upside down tax structure. But we could go down the route of luxury services. I think that's an option. And then one that we've talked about, but I'll have to plug it again. We could reenact our intangible property tax with
Right.
the $250,000 exemption. I say we keep it so that we're only targeting individuals who have more than that in intangible property, stocks, bonds, and notes.
Right.
That could potentially create, if we were to max it out, the state constitution caps what you can caps the amount that you can tax, or it caps the tax amount. So we're going to have to follow those rules. But if you were to max out this new or reenacted intangible properties tax with the $250,000 exemption, you could generate between $1 to $2 billion annually.
Right.
Again, I think there are ways for us to fix our regressive tax code by passing policies that allow us to raise the revenue, to offer more targeted tax relief, to offer better quality public services. We can do these things. And then I'll be remiss if I didn't mention, I guess I'm just coming out with all these different
Let's do it.
possibilities.
Let's fix it all.
Yeah, combined reporting.
Right.
We've had it in the past. Let's reenact it.
I'm
Again,
snapping.
yeah, these are not out of left field.
Right.
These are not things that we haven't or don't have the tools to do in our state. We have the tax structure. For most of these, we've done them in the past. We can reenact combined reporting, close corporate tax loopholes that, to be clear, we're seeing multi-state and multinational corporations shift profits that were made in Florida away from Florida into subsidiaries in tax havens to lower their tax liability. Now, this is legal, but most of the country is using combined reporting. I believe Texas has combined reporting.
Right.
We could be using combined reporting to generate, if we were to do it worldwide. So not only targeting tax havens in the United States, but tax havens everywhere, we could generate upwards over $1 billion annually. The money is there. We have one of the criticisms, or yeah, I think fair criticisms of policies like the Working Floridians Tax Rebate is the cost. Now, I would argue that really if we're going to be giving I would rather give $1 billion to everyday
Right.
working Floridians. But at Florida Policy Institute, we look at budgets and we try to find ways to make reasonable, smart decisions. We have ways to raise the revenue, and we can do it. We can raise more than $1 billion easily by passing any of the things I just mentioned. So, I just wanted to make the plug there. Those are some of the ideas that I have. I think we could do that. We would be as competitive, if not more competitive, than a lot of the other states that have more diversified revenue bases than we do.
Right. Yeah. There are plenty of easily attainable options, and
Yes.
on combined reporting, we literally just saw Target avoid $15 million in taxes solely by taking advantage of the fact that Florida doesn't have combined reporting. It's such an easily solvable policy problem.
And it helps small businesses too.
Right.
How can our small businesses compete with these large corporations that effectively get to cut their tax bill by just shifting profits away through a series of different loopholes?
Right.
Our small businesses are not doing that. So I think it's not only good for our revenue base, which is what I tend to look at, how do we increase that revenue, but also it would help small businesses that are not able to compete with the larger ones that are effectively just lowering their property taxes. Or sorry, well, not well, that's another can of worms. Their corporate income tax.
Right, right, exactly. Well, we will have you back to do a deeper dive on all of those ideas. I just got to say, mansion tax. That's one I'm not super familiar with, but I love the idea that somewhere a Florida realtors lobbyist, the hair on the back of their neck is starting to rise, knowing that folks are starting to talk about mansion taxes in Florida.
Documentary stamp taxes can be adjusted. It's possible. We have the tools.
That's right. That's right. Esteban Santis, thank you for doing this. This was fascinating, and I really do hope some of this stuff starts to get traction. Sort of like I said, this is a legislature that loves to cut taxes. So I mean, here you are. You're giving them a tax cut that would really help a lot of people. So
Yes,
I hope this starts to take root. Thanks,
of
and thanks for doing
course.
this.
Yeah, of course. And if anyone needs to learn more, workinfloridiansrebate.org. It's very simple, workinfloridiansrebate.org. They'll find information, news, research data, and ways to get involved so that we can get this policy passed.
That sounds great. I'll make sure to include a link in the show notes too.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks again for doing this. We'll talk to you soon. Okay. Thank you to Esteban Santis for that. As I mentioned, we'll make sure to put the website in the show notes so you can look up and learn more about the Working Floridians Tax Rebate. And if it sounds like an idea that resonates with you, maybe try reaching out to your local legislator and encouraging them to sign on as a supporter to this idea. As like we said at the top of the show, this is a tax cut, so this should be hopefully pushing on an open door in Tallahassee. That's going to do it for this week. As always, if you haven't already, please think about signing up for a subscription. Easiest way to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are ever behind a paywall. There is an option to pay for a subscription voluntarily if you can afford one. If you've got the means, please think about doing that. Those voluntary paid subscriptions are incredibly important, helping us defray the cost of reporting expenses, like the cost of public records requests, that sort of thing. Okay, well, as always, thanks for listening, and we'll talk again soon.